Ambassador Craig Allen, Professor Raja Mohan, colleagues from industry, valued clients, friends from KPMG. Welcome to this webinar on the China reset and its impact on global trade dynamics and business. Is there a reset in China's situation in the world, including in the business world? In fact, global companies had begun 2 years ago in the light of the US-China trade tensions to de-risk their dependence on China as a key source of their supply chains. Does the pandemic accelerate the search for supply chain resilience and a China Plus strategy? What is the current status and outlook for US-China trade dynamics, including issues pertaining to investment and technology? And how does the paradigm of the Indo-Pacific play into these dynamics? Will there be any impacts on trade and investment flows? To discuss these topics, I'm delighted to introduce two distinguished individuals whose friendship I'm privileged to enjoy. Our first discussant will be Ambassador Craig Allen. Craig and I worked together in the US Department of Commerce when I saw at close quarters his leadership of our work in China, in his role as Deputy Assistant Secretary for China. His long career in public service was capped by President Obama appointing him ambassador to Brunei, a country that was a signatory to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Craig was one of the leading experts in the US government on trade issues with China. Craig now serves as president of the US-China Business Council. Our second guest is one of India's most eminent thinkers on foreign policy and security. Dr. Raja Mohan is currently the director of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Previously, he was the founding director of Carnegie India, distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, and senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. He has authored several books, including Power Realignments in Asia, China, India, and the United States. I have long admired Professor Raja Mohan's writings for the sense of history that informs his acute strategic insights into where the world is moving. Today, we come to you from three locations: Craig in Washington, D.C., Dr. Raja Mohan in Singapore, and I am here in Mumbai. Each location has in its history seen trade and other disputes that have 21st century analogs that we see playing out today. Mumbai has been a key center of trade from and to China and the US, and of course Europe, for over 300 years. Colonial Bombay has been an actor in one of the early and infamous trade wars, the Opium Wars, which had its economic origins in the trade deficit that Britain had with China in the 19th century. Now that was an awful way to deal with a trade deficit, and hopefully things will be different in the 21st century. The Malacca Straits, not far from Singapore, where Dr. Raja Mohan is, has been a strategic location for trade for a very long time. When we talk today about the freedom of navigation, Malacca and its neighborhood have been important in that regard for at least 5 centuries. And Washington, D.C. is, of course, where US policies on markets and trade with Asia have been forged since the beginning of the 20th century. The US, as an exporting nation, saw trade as a primary purpose of its early engagement with Asia. The US, in fact, began its engagement with India in the 18th century, focusing on trade. As an aside, the US consulate in Mumbai, then known as Bombay, was opened in 1838 on the orders of President Martin Van Buren. Opening a consular outpost in Bombay was arguably President Van Buren's most notable accomplishment in all of his otherwise disastrous presidency. Today, with the coronavirus crisis, the move towards openness in trade that has been a strong secular trend for most of at least 3 decades now can well take a pause. This pandemic has led to searching questions about global versus local, about resilience and self-reliance versus interdependence. Globalization had already been under threat over the last 5 years, starting with Brexit and intensified by the inward focus of the Trump administration. At the same time, during this pandemic, on account of digital technology, it's been demonstrated that business can be conducted globally, digitally, without having to travel. While the physical world is becoming isolationist, the virtual digital world is drawing closer together. This webinar is a great example. And as the world focuses on the pandemic, the biggest economic rivalry in history continues to play out. The US and China have become competitors in every sense: technological, economic, trade, ideological, security, diplomatic, and political. COVID-19 has certainly added new dimensions to the ongoing trade dynamics, further closing supply chains, restricting trade, accelerating the technology war, and ratcheting up protectionist feelings. My own views, though, is that international partnerships and economic integration will return to a prominent place in a post-COVID world. The sudden halt in commerce and travel precipitated by the outbreak will not reverse overnight, but when the crisis passes, we're likely to find fresh confirmation of what we already know about globalization, that it is convenient to target but impossible to stop. Amidst all this, it is worth looking at whether there will be economic muscle placed towards advancing the strategic Indo-Pacific construct as a region of vigorous and open commerce and trade. The major players in the Indo-Pacific have the opportunity to make the Quad, or now the Quad Plus, more functional in scope and scale. Will a trade and economic dimension be developed alongside the security aspects? Can the successor to the TPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, expand to add other countries and play this role? A spate of high-quality trade agreements could well help advance the otherwise potentially fragile global recovery. So let me now call upon Craig to share his opening views on how he views the China-US dynamic today and in a post-COVID world. Following that, we'll hear from Professor Raj Mohan, and then we'll open it up for your questions and a discussion. So over to you, Craig.
Thank you, Arun. I hope you could hear me well. And greetings from Washington. I'd like to give a quick overview of US-China relations with a heavy emphasis on trade, but what I think is the most important part is really technology, the US-China struggle over, if you will, the innovation ecosystem. But let me start out with just a little bit of a level set here of what's going on in the US, and just mention that we have a number of different interrelated crises, so all sort of stacked up one upon the other. And it's in that context that we are beginning the process of engaging in an election. The first crisis is obviously epidemiological. COVID has been handled very poorly in this country. The second crisis that we have is a social justice debate within the United States, started by the killing of George Floyd. As a result of COVID, unemployment has gone from 3.5% to about 13–14% overnight. And that has profound consequences. The government has reacted quite well, but our debt has skyrocketed as a result. And finally, we're in the middle of a divisive election. So that is sort of the cocktail that Washington is brewing in right now. For hundreds of years, China has been an election topic within the United States, but this year it may become the central topic of the election. I hope not, but both sides are using China to clobber the other side for being too weak, for not standing up, and suggesting that they would do a better job. So I think that we could summarize US-China and say that we're at the worst state of relations over the last 70 years since the Cultural Revolution. And I think that if you were to use a political science term, you would say that we are caught on the horns of a security dilemma. In other words, Party A takes a step that Party B looks at as offensive. Party B takes a defensive step, which Party A looks at as defensive. And that ensues in a vicious cycle of continued defensive actions that the other side looks at as offensive. And that downward cycle can continue a long, long way. I think that the cycle today is exacerbated by almost a complete breakdown in communications. Now, when I was lucky enough to have Arun as my boss, I remember Secretary Kerry going in to see Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping kind of smirked and asked Secretary Kerry, well, how many US-China dialogues are there? And Secretary Kerry had no idea. It wasn't in his briefing book. So she replied, well, there are 96 official dialogues. Today, I could say there are maybe two, one over trade and one over North Korea, and that's it. There is very little communication going on between the two governments other than that, and all collaborative activity has ceased. So how did we get here? I would say that there were two turning points. For the Chinese side, really the critical moment was the Great Financial Recession, 2009. And at that point, the Chinese, at that time, Vice Premier Wang Qishan told Secretary of Treasury Hank Paulson, Hank, we used to look at you as our teacher, and now we realize that we have nothing left to learn. And I think symbolically, that was a very important turning point in history, where the Chinese said, well, we've caught up, basically. What are we going to do now? And at that point, they reverted a little bit to their traditional modes. And by traditional, I mean communist, the spirit of Yan'an, but also reflecting imperial patterns. And for many countries around the world, that combination of the Chinese looking at communist and imperialist sort of foreign policy objectives is quite uncomfortable, including for the United States. Now, in 2017, when the Trump administration came into power, there was a very significant shift. And that is encapsulated in our national security strategy, which was written during the transition and which was very much put into effect. That national security strategy states that the U.S. primary concern in the foreign policy area will no longer be terrorism. Afghanistan, Iraq is over. We are going to be focused on great power competition. And China and Russia and Iran were put as our major focal points. And that really has been very systematically implemented across every bureaucracy in the United States, across really every area of the US government. And indeed, today, as Arun noted, we have, I would say, systemic competition or oftentimes confrontation across every area of diplomacy. Very strong competition in ideology, but also people-to-people visas, trade, finance, investment, technology. In a way, you could say that the United States and China are engaged on a multi-front war, and each of these different areas would be a different front in this Cold War. And at some points, one battlefield, maybe trade, will become quiet, but it doesn't mean other battlefields, say finance or technology or others, will become quiet. And the old, quieter battlefields can heat up again at any time. So I don't like to use military metaphors, but I think it's instructive in this particular case. So President Trump believes that bilateral trade balances are important, And when the United States has a bilateral trade balance, it reflects some form of unfairness on the other side. And I think that this theory of trade is completely discredited by anyone who has taken economics. But nonetheless, it is a core principle of the president. Therefore, it's not surprising that because of the very large trade imbalance historic between China and the United States, that China would become a special focal point of the president. And when, after the change of government, this led to a series of negotiations that went nowhere. And then it led to the what we would call the 301 report, which identified a number of very legitimate areas of concern where China has been not met WTO criteria, including intellectual property rights, forced technology transfer, agriculture, financial services, state-owned enterprises, subsidies, and cyber. And when we were not able to really get to any meaningful improvements there, the tariffs went up. And there were 4 tranches of tariffs. Today, trade between US and China has about roughly 17% tariff on imports coming in and exports going out. And the president was on the verge of dramatically increasing those tariffs when the two sides reached what is called the Phase 1 agreement. And the Phase 1 agreement addresses particularly financial services, agriculture, and intellectual property rights. But there's a second part of this agreement that is more, you could say, innovative, or I would say problematic, and non-traditional. So the policy elements of the agreement are very much in accordance with normal WTO principles. The second part of the agreement is our quantitative measures by which the Chinese have undertaken commitments, and they do recognize that they are commitments, to roughly double US imports in services, manufacturing, agriculture, and energy over the course of 2 years. And I think many of America's and China's trading partners find that highly problematic, potentially WTO violative. But I think that we need not worry too much about it. We're not about to come close to meeting the targets. With the possible exception of agriculture, and agriculture for election purposes is very important to the president, and the Chinese know that, and increases in agricultural exports from the US to China are being manifest. So I'd like to move on and talk about technology because I think that this is profoundly important. And indeed, I would argue that the tariffs and the trade agreement Phase 1 are really a sideshow to what's happening on the technology side. And it's not simple, but the Trump administration has taken a series of legal, bureaucratic, administrative, and judicial measures to really tighten up control of US technology exports, with a particular reference to stopping the Chinese from getting access to many sensitive American technologies. And I would have to say that this doesn't come out of the blue. It's not because of bad temper. It's because of bad policies on the Chinese part. The Made in China 2025, I've argued, has been WTO violative in every chapter. It seems to have disappeared, but it's been replaced by other policies with other names. And I think that we see that in the recent National People's Congress meeting, the new names for their technology policy are quote unquote new economic drivers, or quote unquote high level industry, or quote unquote new infrastructure. But basically, those are the Made in China 2025 policies. What is also new, or relatively new, is Xi Jinping's emphasis on civil-military fusion, suggesting that whatever technologies the civil side have should be made available to the military, and vice versa as well. And that has given hawks in Washington all the ammunition that they need to stop technology transfers from China to the United States when possible. Another Chinese law that is quite problematic is the 2017 intelligence law, which requires Chinese citizens to cooperate with Chinese intelligence agencies upon their request. And that begs a lot of questions about Chinese students in the United States studying technologies that might be of military interest. So what has the United States done about this? Well, there's been a whole series of actions, and I would put those actions in really three categories. One is export controls, kind of a traditional category. The second is quite new to the US, and that is really inbound investment controls, and they have been dramatically changed as a result of China. And the third is a heightened emphasis on counterintelligence, which is led by the FBI, or the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So let me spend just a couple of minutes on the export control side, because I think that's really profoundly interesting from a global innovation ecosystem perspective. It's a dry bureaucratic document, but the implications are profound. So the first thing that the United States has done is to restrict specific companies in China from obtaining licensed American technology, particularly Huawei. The Huawei debate is very important, and I won't go into it in detail here, but it is symbolic of a favored Chinese company that currently controls 26% of 5G patents. Maybe that's not enough, so in 6G they need 50%, I'm not sure. But a company that is really surging and has caught the attention of many nations. The second major change in US export control policy is redefining what is a military end user and a military end use, and making it much more difficult for American companies to export a product to a company that might have a subsidiary that has a military end user or end use. And that goes back to the civil-military fusion that I mentioned before. The third area is that the Department of Commerce has taken upon itself authorities to define emerging technologies and foundational technologies. A very difficult thing to do, but as they do that, it will profoundly and limit China's access to new technologies that will drive Chinese behavior. It will drive third country behavior, including Indian high-tech behavior, and it will drive American behavior, and perhaps in a manner that supports US-India. That would be a positive outcome in my view. I wouldn't count on it, but it's positive. And finally, the United States has expanded its extraterritorial reach of its export controls through what we call the foreign product rule, suggesting that if a semiconductor, for example, is made with American controlled technology by TSMC, for example, in Taiwan, then the US gives itself the right to put on a license for the export of that semiconductor made by American technology to Huawei. And that is a major expansion of U.S. extraterritorial reach. So I would note that this technology war is really feeding into what is a highly unstable geopolitical situation. We have taken a lot of action on human rights, on Tibet, on Xinjiang. Hong Kong is a bleeding sore. And there are any number of other problems. Now, is this short term or medium term or longer term? It's not about Donald Trump, really. It's much bigger than that. And as evidence of that, I would submit to you that the Congress is currently looking at some 308 pieces of anti-China legislation because the Congress feels like the president isn't strong enough. And in our system, with three co-equal branches of government, the executive branch and the congressional branch are competing against each other. And within that context, both parties are competing against each other to be more anti-China. And so therefore, it's difficult to say that this is anything other than a structural issue. I would like to concur and end with on a positive side, and I agree with Arun completely that if we were to see a transitional government in January, that a different administration would take a very different approach. I think it would be confrontational, definitely, against China. I don't think that could be avoided. But I do also think that it would work much more effectively with allies, friends, and partners, and work within the multilateral institutions, potentially rejoining the TPP. Now, Arun and I perhaps have an unnatural fondness for the CPTPP because we both worked on it. But I do think that it is a very excellent standard or measure of next age agreements. And I would note that the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang about 5 weeks ago said that China was looking at joining the CPTPP. And it will remain to be seen whether or not both the US and China will try to join this club. And if they do, oh, what drama. How fun will that be to watch the fireworks associated with that? In the meantime, I'm not very optimistic about the WTO. I'm hopeful that it will be able to survive. If we do go into a different administration, I do think that you're going to find a much more appropriate, a much more copacetic, comfortable view with the WTO. But if there is no change of administration, I don't see how that would happen. I'll end by saying, quoting the former Director General of the WTO, Subachai from Thailand, who's now deceased. But he said that he wondered when China joined the WTO whether or not the WTO could survive China's entry. I think if he were alive today, he would rephrase the question and say, I wonder if the WTO can survive China's entry into it and America's reaction to China's re-emergence in the global world. And I don't know the answer to that, but I think we need to address that question in a very sober manner. So with that, Arun, may I step back, please, and turn over the podium to someone much smarter than I and better looking.
Thank you, Craig. Let me turn it over to Professor Raja Mohan.
Thank you, Arun. I think thank you for inviting me, and I think I've learned so much from Ambassador Allen. He's already laid it all out. So I'll just make 3 points. I mean, essentially to reinforce some of the things he said. Maybe some complementary points. but focused more on the politics of it and not on the commercial or on the economic. So I think I fully agree with Ambassador that this is really a structural change in the US-China relationship that we are seeing for nearly 5 decades since Nixon went to China in '72 and Kissinger went there a year before. The normalization of US-China relationship in the '70s created a profound transformation in global politics, certainly in Asia, and then the economic integration between them has transformed international system in a very fundamental way of bringing rapid growth in China that benefited large number of Western countries and Asian countries, which benefited from the US-China engagement and the emergence of supply chains, etc. This story is familiar to all of you. But I think that relationship is under a rupture. I think the point, I mean, all the dimensions of it, as Ambassador Allen pointed out. But I think a rupture is very much possible. And while there will be attempts politically probably to limit it, to fix it, but I think it looks like it is going to be a reasonable chance that this relationship would rupture. But I think it's important to see this crisis in US-China relationship as a broader crisis, not just between two countries, but as the crisis of globalization itself. That the assumptions the US made after 89-91, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the new Washington consensus, domestic deregulation, freer markets within the advanced countries, the Reagan-Thatcher model, if you will, and the adoption of that by almost everyone in the world, that the export of that model, I mean, to the rest of the world, saw that there is now a irreversible globalization, which makes it easier for capital and labor to move across. The idea of open borders for goods and for people, and the accelerated transformations that we saw in the last 30 to 40 years of dramatic growth. And China's entry into the WTO, as Ambassador said, is very much part of it, and the US-China interdependence was very much part of it. But I think there is a backlash against globalization. I think it's important to note that. I mean, that's the political point I wanted to make. I mean, sitting in Singapore, I mean, I shouldn't be talking about US politics to the ambassador who's sitting in Washington, but I think sitting from outside and watching it, that the consequence of the US-China interdependence and what it did to the US domestic politics. Now, you could disagree with the assessment, you could disagree with the argument, the proposition that WTO, international trade and globalization have not worked for a set of people within the United States. That the Trumps, I mean, there were disaffection even before, and Trump's channeled them, and those are the people probably who put him across the line in the Electoral College in 2016. So I think, and then the assumption, the second assumption that the US made, that by supporting China's rise, China will become a responsible stakeholder, and the China would be like us eventually. They will have a middle class, they'll become democratic, they'll be our partners in shaping the world. But of course, China has had its own ambitions, legitimate, I think. They want to be a great power, just like the US became a great power. And of course, they can always claim they were a great power before. So therefore, the idea that somehow China is just going to be a happy, join the club on American terms, I think was fundamentally mistaken. China was going to set its own terms, and as it became bigger and more powerful, it is set its own terms. So both on the economic side, the consequences of China, as somebody would say in the US, have gamed the WTO, has gamed the system, and leading to negative consequences for many of its partners, and that people are willing to mobilize that. I mean, I think we can get into the deeper argument, does globalization benefit everyone? But the fact is, there are losers from globalization. They've been politically mobilized, and they're the ones who having an effect. So I would say that moment where the US-China integration, the US-China partnership is breaking down, both on the economic and political side. And I think dealing with that will be probably for all of us, those who are outside US and China, is going to be the single most important challenge looking ahead. The second point I wanted to make was on the US domestic politics. That is, this idea that I think Ambassador said that, look, even if Biden comes back, that the idea of a restoration, that we had an aberration, it was a nightmare, there was a, shall we say, a pretender to the throne sitting in the White House. If only you get the good guys back in, Trump will go and we're back to normal. I don't see that having the Democrats win, even all the three aspects, the two houses as well as the White House, is going to fundamentally alter. And this is where I think I want to make a complementary point to what Ambassador Allen said. It's about social justice. The argument within the US politics that there is a section, the so-called progressives in the Democratic Party, who are contesting every single assumption of globalization. Now, you can say, look, the question, what we don't know, I think where the US domestic politics is important, is the fact that they're testing Biden, they're pushing Biden to a leftward direction. And Trump and Biden is largely doing that. Now, whether it is on, Trump talks about free trade, he talks about fair trade and not fair trade. He talks about fair trade and not free trade. He talks about industrial policy. He talks about, he's questioning, I think, whether it is for electoral expediency or a genuine need to unite the party, that he's taking positions. And if you saw the unity platform between Biden and Trump that was announced, they fended off some of the extreme proposals, but there is. I think the question is the justice question, that if everyone did not benefit equally from globalization, is it going to go to some pressure for redistribution of the benefits, of state doing more things, from healthcare to free college is a great demand, free everything these days. I mean, the kind of things that the US, it was impossible to imagine that you could put those demands. Today, those demands are being made. So therefore, how this plays out domestically is going to be an issue. And I think in some ways, there is a commonality between Trump and, when Trump said WTO did not work for American working class. Today, when Biden says, look, I will do a foreign policy for the middle class. My foreign economic policy is for the American middle class. That he is saying the same thing, but in a different form. And that he says, look, I'm not going to sign another free trade agreement in a hurry. I won't do it without the environmentalists and the human rights and a whole lot of labor standards all being present. So therefore, he's going to resurrect a whole lot of domestic redistributionist agenda onto trade negotiations. So therefore, I think the politics of trade were there before. When you saw the TPP, it didn't get through the Congress. Trump, Obama had to, and Pelosi had to do a lot of imaginative tricks to get finally to get the administration to sign up. So I think that pressures, I think today have become much stronger. So therefore, you have actually fairly strong internal contestation within the US. So that brings me to that the domestic politics in the United States has become the single most important variable in the way the global order evolves. So if the US domestic politics goes in a particular direction, I think there will be consequences. So this idea of the American foreign policy elite, I mean, two important people are sitting here in front of me, the idea that somehow you can insulate foreign policy from the larger domestic political processes. I think on trade, of course, there were always domestic politics, but the sense of there was a freedom of action that has shrunk quite significantly. So how much of it, how it affects the next administration is going to be the big one. What we don't know, Americans, unlike Indians, wash their linen in public. What's happening inside China? I mean, that idea that there's no politics in China, I don't buy into that. For a country of that size. So if things go wrong with the US, I think there would be questions raised, because maintaining good relations with the US was always a major function of the leadership. And if the leadership has miscalculated, overreached, and made too many enemies, then I think questions will be raised. The same nationalist forces will say, you are responsible. The emperor is responsible for the crisis. Now, when that moment will unfold. But I think if the pressure from the US mounts, there will be domestic repercussions. And I think I would say watching out for that would also be one. Finally, the point about Indo-Pacific, which Arun asked me, I think this idea that the Chinese sense of confidence, not just with the West is in terminal decline. Our moment has come. For most Indians would be very apna time aa gaya. That the idea that look, our moment has come, we can do what we want, and that simultaneously you can push the Japanese in East China Sea, you can push your friends in South China Sea, you can go into Ladakh, you can be condescending to everyone in the world. I think this idea that somehow that the others will not come together, others will not coalesce, and that the Chinese margin for maneuver was so large that they can prevent a coalition, countervailing coalition, and that they can divide the West and divide the Asia. That assumption, I think, is under test today. Even a terribly incompetent administration, if you will, has mobilized the Anglos first. So all the Anglos are now back in the fold. Some Europeans, I think, will come back. So this idea that even the US at its worst can still mobilize sufficient power to build a countervailing coalition. And I think if the Chinese continue to do what they're doing, the idea of Indo-Pacific, I think, will gain traction. Certainly in India, it is gained traction. That what was a hesitant non-alignment that we pursued all these years, that today we see that the US, thanks to what's happened in Ladakh, the residual inhibitions about engaging the US are breaking down. And whether this will translate into the economic domain, I think that's what is interesting. If India dissociates, tries to dissociate somewhat from the digital dominance of China, if there's going to be more interesting collaboration between the American companies in the emerging field, at least, last few days of investment, you guys know more about it than I'll ever know. But I think the interesting possibilities that have emerged, I'm not so sure about actually supply chains will actually come into India, but they could be in the digital and the technological space. A lot more collaborations between Indian and the US companies are certainly possible. But on the security side, it's already beginning to happen on the India-Japan, India-US, India-Australia. That is certainly going to expand, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And internally in India, the political opposition to engaging the US has finally gone. So a government is quite bold. I think they can do a lot of it. Gives them flag always is a convenient thing. There, I think it is going to make them bolder in partnering the US. And since Indian definitions are capacious, Atmanirbhar Bharat is reliance can sit with Google and do something, that is self-reliance. If WhatsApp can do payments in India, similar to what Chinese do, that is self-reliance. So this debate on self-reliance, I'll stop here. Is India moving to creating national champions? That finally, while India has had problems with globalization, can it do liberalization internally? And does that give us more space to work with the Americans on a scale that so far it seemed impossible? So I'll stop here. But to summarize, essentially, it's a big historic moment, but it is linked to the domestic politics and how the disaffection against globalization and open borders is going to be mobilized in the US. And I think it opens, I would think, for India and US to do a lot more together if there is enough smartness, irrespective of who wins the election. I think Delhi has an opportunity today because both Trump talked about a G10 or G11. One of the first things Biden says he will do is convene a summit of democracies. So I think for India, it's a moment where if it can get its domestic act together, that there is actually a whole lot of things it can do with the United States. I'll stop here.
No, thank you very much, both. There's such tremendous insights from very two different angles. I think on the point you made about domestic politics, I think it was one of the in negotiating the TPP, while a lot of energy was spent working with the other 11 countries, there was not enough energy spent managing domestic stakeholders. For example, the US has always had a trade adjustment assistance program that was never showcased or really marketed or understood by stakeholders. Because every trade agreement, there are winners and losers within a country. And the question is, how do you support those who may lose? So I think that's a very important point. I also really like the point about your view that China will only join on its own terms. It's really interesting in Davos last year. Um, China's narrative was, look, you have one set of views and you have one set of values, we have another. Our value is the stability of society. Your value may be freedom of expression. But understand that there are two ways of looking at the world. So I think just reinforcing the point that you made. Um, so let's take some questions. I think um, so. The question is: was the world unprepared for the situation that we see today, with over dependence on a single country like China? And I think I don't know, Craig. Do you want to take a shot at that from your working with U.S. corporations?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Arun. I think that the COVID crisis has really brought home in stark relief that we have been excessively dependent on China. And I wouldn't say really China, but a single point of failure generally, which happened to be in China, for a lot of our personal protective equipment. And that has led to a very vigorous response to try to bring some of that manufacturing certainly out of China and preferably back to the United States. Let me give you one example. There is an antiviral textile that is made into surgical gowns and other equipment. And it is produced in one place in the world, and that is Wuhan, China. And when COVID struck Wuhan, exports of that disappeared. They were not able to produce. So I think that I like to look at the issue as avoiding a single point of failure, regardless of where it is. But I think that we need to be very, very careful here and not have the misconception that supply chain resiliency is free. Supply chain resiliency comes at the expense of supply chain efficiency. And if the US government is going to be forcibly changing or forcing companies to change their supply chains, they better, out of China, they better be careful, because that might lead to the demise of US companies. So there's a very difficult balance here between efficiency and resiliency. And we need both. And that implies, in my view, a longer term process, a decade-long process to ensure that we no longer are vulnerable to a single point of failure. So I hope that that's a helpful perspective, Arun.
Thank you, Craig. I have a question about Hong Kong. So what do you think US companies will do about the recent policy regarding Hong Kong, since many companies have distribution hubs in Hong Kong, and it could have a big impact on their business?
I could say yesterday I was on the phone with my friends in the government trying to figure out what is the U.S. policy with regard to Hong Kong. And I'm still not clear. So the president announced a change in policy, but we're going to really have to wait and see how what is printed in the specific regulations or printed in the Federal Registrar. But what I think, what I understand is that at least till today, that Hong Kong's existence as a separate customs territory within and as a WTO member has not been challenged. Also, the Hong Kong peg has not been challenged. What is very unclear to me is the vulnerability of individuals who may have affected, who may have supported the national security law and thereby reduce Hong Kong's autonomy, to what degree will there be sanctions? Will there be financial sanctions only against senior Communist Party officials in Hong Kong, or will there be, and I would say that would be a minimum, or will that be much broader, including to Hong Kongers who may be running large companies? And I don't know the answer to that. We're going to have to wait and see what the details are. I do think that this is, at a bare minimum, it will lead to marginal investments going outside of Hong Kong, probably Singapore, Tokyo, Taipei, KL, I think will probably benefit, maybe Manila, Jakarta. But right now it's a little bit early to say. However, this is has become a huge ideological issue in both Washington and in Beijing, and there's no getting around it. In Beijing, the comment is, this is about national sovereignty. What part of that do you not understand? And in Washington, it's about autonomy and democracy. What part of that do you not understand? And you can't bridge those. These are value divides that are impossible. So I don't know where it will go, but I know the direction. Thank you.
So Craig, you may not be aware that yesterday there was a big announcement, or the day before yesterday, very big investment by Google in Geo, which is part of the Reliance Group. And the speculation is that a result of the US-China dynamics, US companies coming here. Of course, Google is shut out of China by and large. Just an observation to share. Let me ask Dr. Raja Mohan a question. There's an observation that many young urban people in India do not have the view of the US and the West that they had in the past. Do you have a sense of that? Is that changing?
I think it's changed quite some time ago. I mean, assuming from a negative to the positive. But it's always, it was really the elite that was posturing anti-Western. But the Indian public and Indian middle class actually thrived in the West. I mean, certainly in the English-speaking world. Through the 60s, where Indian diaspora went was US, UK, Australia, Canada. So I don't think at the mass level there was, post-71, the question of Bangladesh, that kind of stuff. But the mass level, the engagement, the comfort level with the West was always strong. The problem was with the governments. That began to change in the 90s and by 2000s, and certainly under George Bush, we kind of got over a number of issues like nuclear, Kashmir. So I think we've seen even in the recent crisis, the US coming out firmly, strongly in support of India in the crisis that it has had with Pakistan and China. So I think there is a huge transformation. Other day, somebody was saying, maybe other than Poland, today you can say the best views of the US, irrespective of who the president is, certainly in India. So that I think we've gone over that phase where the systems were at loggerheads, but the people never had really much of a problem. But there are other issues that are coming up. Every Indian engineer thinks he has a right to work in the United States. But I think we'll have to be prepared for closing of some borders. I mean, I think it's that the great expansion of the Indian diaspora in the 1960s, that will come to an end because of the politics of it. But as Trump said, merit-based immigration, I think, would still work in favor of Indians. So I think Indians are not sensitive enough to US domestic politics because we take it for granted in a very narrow sense. But I think today it's in a process of extraordinary change. And I think we'll have to devote more attention to understanding those changes.
Oh, thank you. So I think we've pretty much come to the end of the conversation. And I think some great points were made. I think Craig talked about the epidemiological, racial, and economic crisis coming together at the same time. Professor Raja Mohan, you referred to the Biden-Sanders unity platform, which in some sense is a response to that crisis. You also referred to the idea of the Conference of Summit of Democracies. So I think one of the interesting things that's going on is a lot of good ideas are coming out at this time in the US election scene. So wait and watch with great interest. So I want to thank you, Professor Mohan and Craig. Thank you for your time. I mean, this has been extremely interesting for all of us listening. So thanks once again.